Hello, and welcome to Hopeful Conversations, brought to you by Robbie's Hope Foundation. I am your host, Kari Eckert. Joining me today is Kristen Nash, founder of the William G. Nash Foundation, which is working to foster harm reduction for students in crisis by facilitating honest discussion around the use of psychedelics. The foundation supports research, grants, and awareness of harm reduction approaches to improve college student safety. Correspondingly, the William G. Nash Foundation supports college student-run businesses, especially those with a social impact, to expand and grow through giving grants. Today, we will be discussing an awareness around harm reduction with psychedelics among young people as a general topic. Kristen, thank you so much for joining me today on Hopeful Conversations.
Thank you, Kari. Thank you for that kind introduction.
Can you begin by giving us a brief background of the William G. Nash Foundation and its mission?
Sure. I need to start that by talking about my son, Will, who we lost in March of 2020, so just over 3 years ago. And Will was such a bright light. He was 2 months away from his college graduation, had just started his own business, which is why we also do the student entrepreneur grants. He was so excited about it. He was also, had a job waiting for him in San Francisco and was just ready to start his life. He was fluent in Spanish. He loved to travel. He loved music. He had so many friends, and he's just missed dearly, of course, every day by his family and friends. But he died in an accident due to psychedelic use. And he and his friends used psilocybin. He went into like a psychotic state, and an accident happened, and I can talk more about that. But for me, understanding what happened to my son pointed me in the direction of the need for real drug education, harm reduction, and more discussions around psychedelic risks and safety. And so as a foundation, that's what we're working on now.
Thanks for that explanation. And I'm so sorry for your loss. Will sounds like a fantastic young man. And I just, Kristen, we could even talk about 3/6/2020. That's like a week before COVID shut down like everything. I can't imagine being a grieving mom during that time. That had to be so hard.
Well, it was amazing because he died on March 7th. And the following week, his school shut down for the pandemic. So he would have been home with us. It was the last Friday night. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But we're here to talk about harm reduction for young people. We could talk about Will and Robbie for, I think, a long time, because that's just something that you and I shared, being moms that have lost kids. But I want to talk about harm reduction and psychedelics because it's such a, I live in Colorado and things are changing rapidly. And I think education is so important. And many of our listeners are young college students. So can we talk about, or can you, because you're the expert, talk about the key principles of harm reduction that the William G. Nash Foundation follows when addressing psychedelic use in order to implement guardrails for young people?
Yeah. So I want to be clear too, we're uplifting others who are experts in the field to generate the needed education. So what I share, it's not just coming from me, it's coming from other experts who have worked with these substances, including mental health professionals and others. I wonder if we can start the conversation with one sort of gating idea, which is the confusion between the benefits of psychedelics being seen in clinical research for mental health and the use of these in what we'll call naturalistic or recreational or settings that are outside the clinic, because those are two very different things.
They
and
are.
Often in media articles and quite honestly legalization efforts, those two ideas are conflated.
Absolutely.
And so I just want to point out that in the clinical trials, first of all, people are carefully screened. There are many serious contraindications to psychedelic use, including family histories of mental illness. And so screening is just critical. So that happens. Then, of course, they're in, they undergo a very strict protocol with usually 2 trained professionals in the room. They have a preparation session, they have a dosing session, and then they have integration afterward. And all those steps are really, really important. And I will say a lot of the trials, MDMA, for example, and we should say MDMA assisted therapy, because also the benefits aren't solely from the drug. They're from the drug plus the therapy. So MDMA assisted therapy probably will have FDA approval sometime next year. A lot of the trials, so that's the drug sort of furthest along. A lot of the trials are in small groups. So we call that N in clinical research. The N is small, meaning some of them are in maybe 30 patients or, something like that. So it's hard to make, it's hard to say how those same results will apply to a larger population. So I just want to be really clear when we're talking about psychedelics, right, that the studies in no way are recommending safety or efficacy for use recreationally or in a self-medicating way. So I just want to be really clear
No,
about that.
that's super, super helpful because in Colorado, being a state that we have the legalization of marijuana and we started with recreational. Recreational is a term that's, I think, very understood. And I follow even marijuana in other states because it's not legal everywhere, let alone psychedelics. And Colorado is on the path that we have legalized psychedelics as well. And the rollout is a little bit concerning for me who's trying to be informed. It's confusing. So that distinction is super, super helpful. So for recreational, that's what we want to visit about versus clinical.
Yeah. And maybe we can use the term personal use,
Yeah.
because there are a lot of people using, when you say recreational, I mean, to be honest, my son was using it in a recreational context. Some people, I have a friend who lost her daughter after taking psilocybin in December, but she was using it on her own for self-healing. So she was self-medicating. Some people might be using it for creative purposes or spiritual purposes. So for the purposes of this conversation, all of those uses that are sort of on your own, we could say do it yourself uses.
Sure.
Maybe we just call it personal use, but we're meaning all of those uses, outside of a formal container or formal framework.
That's a good distinction. So what kind of harm reduction for self-use guardrails, particularly for young people, are helpful?
Right. Okay. So, I'm trying to think of where to begin with that. I think most important is the idea that psychedelics aren't for everyone. And as a young person is thinking about experimenting, there are many different ways to explore oneself and healing. And if you look at, it's often said that psychedelics have been used for thousands of years in indigenous cultures. There are many ways that have been used for thousands of years, like breathwork practices, yoga practices, meditation practices, chanting, ecstatic dance, drumming, that can lead one into altered explorational states without the risk of the drugs. And so I think that's a really, important and interesting thing for a young person to explore. I also want to say that we don't really understand how psychedelics impact the developing brain. And that's a significant point for young people to consider, because we know that a family history or a propensity for schizophrenia or bipolar can trigger that when a young person takes psychedelics. And so it's a really important consideration, right? Like I would always urge a young person, just wait, wait until you're 25, because there's a little bit of a gamble around how that powerful substance is going to impact on your own physiology. And I'm not saying it happens often, but it can trigger a lifelong condition. And to me, that's a risk that I wouldn't wish on anyone.
No.
Okay.
And
So
it's tough.
sorry. Yep. Go
No,
ahead.
there's so much to cover.
Yeah, there really is. And so it's like, I feel like I have to say so much up front before I get into, okay, so if you were going to try this, first of all, never do it alone. And I would say, I would always recommend have an experienced guide, maybe, and a trusted friend, both, right? Because the experienced guide can guide you through the whole process. And then the trusted friend is just there as a comfort. I would say, the guide could help with screening. So to go through screening to make sure that you don't have any serious red flags and in your history. The guide would help set an intention, which is really important, would help with mindset and setting. I think understanding how psychedelics amplify one's mindset. So if you're worried or anxious about anything, psychedelics are going to amplify that. If there's anything uncomfortable in your environment, from someone's energy to lighting to music, those subtle discomforts can be amplified and trigger. So you really have to understand those factors that are coming into the experience. And I think one of the key things we understand about psychedelics is their unpredictability. So the same person can take the same dose of the same drug on a different day and have a completely different reaction. We're used to alcohol, where we sort of know based on dose what that's going to do. And so psychedelics aren't like that.
Wow.
So all those factors are really important. Obviously, then having someone there with you to keep you safe, to know what to do in an emergency, and honestly, to help you integrate on the other side. So I would say those are sort of all the factors to consider.
A lot of factors. And I love that on your foundation's website, you talk about just young people and the development of young people and how young people experiment, and that not like how we do so much traditional drug education is about abstinence, alcohol education, sex education, everything abstinence. And is that realistic for young people who, forever, they experiment at a higher level? Um, I'll turn that back to you. What do you think of that difference?
Yeah, no, I think that's critical. One of the things we've done that I'm really proud of is we've supported a drug education curriculum called Safety First. And it was just adopted by the Stanford University Reach Lab. If you're familiar, they have like cannabis and vaping toolkits and things.
I
So
need to look into that because there's
yeah,
issues of those substances as well.
yeah,
Fantastic.
yeah.
Stanford.
So Safety First has something like 15 modules, and it covers all drugs from a harm reduction perspective. So offering, real information, teaching critical thinking and media literacy and things like that. And there is a module on psychedelics. So, yeah, no, agree 100%. We need reality-based education for our kids.
Oh, that's fantastic. How does like a parent educate themselves, or even a young person, about psychedelics and all of these like such details versus like picking up a bottle of, or a beer, of a bottle of vodka when you're underage and it's not legal? Like this is there's so much more.
Yeah, there's so much more. And I guess the one important thing I wanted to say too is testing your substances. And I when I gave you the description, I didn't say that, but you should test your substances because more and more, especially with MDMA, it can also be adulterated. So I would say that. And there are a couple of resources I would suggest. One is called the Fireside Project. So it's Fireside, I think it's fireside.org. And that is a psychedelic crisis hotline. If someone is in a crisis, obviously if you're tripping, it's hard to call, but the person maybe sitting with you could call and they can just help you. Sometimes you can de-escalate really easily by changing the environment. But I would say it's also really, really important not to wait if you think you need help. Just don't hesitate to call 911. There are a lot of resources on the Fireside website, and I can give you some more, like if you have show notes, I could give you some more
That's
resources
helpful.
and places to go. Yeah, where
Young
kids.
people are so adults are so afraid of Narcan. There's so much when I sit on countywide things like, oh, we can't give Narcan to young people. And young people are like, yeah, give me the Narcan. I want to be prepared. I know that I will. These are kids. So that's fantastic. Fireside.org. But what else can a young person do to educate themselves, to be prepared?
Yeah, well, I think intention setting. So the other harm reduction idea is, you would never want to do psychedelics like the same day you decide to, right? It's something that you would think about, um, do research, plan for, and set an intention. So why do you want to try these? What is your intention? And being really clear about that. And then, as we discussed earlier in the conversation, following all of those practices to ensure your own safety. But really setting an intention and being mindful about that, about your environment, about music, about the people around you, just being really intentional. Yeah.
Not something to just try at a party because somebody else
Right.
is.
Yeah. It's a pretty bad idea ever to do that. And even I would say at a concert, just in these really kind of, you don't know what kind of energy you're going to be around. I mean, kids do that, right? But it's just, that's a kind of situation where things can go sideways. And, people who are really advocating for psychedelic use for healing, you know, have a lot of respect and reverence for these substances. And so I try to come at it from that perspective. I try to really honor their power and their potential to shift people's minds. And so I just think young people should treat them with respect and kind of understand the potency and the power and the lineage. Yeah, if they choose to try.
I appreciate that because you even in researching in your website, you truly just call it a paradox, the psychedelics potential therapeutic benefits, and an organization like ourselves trying to help people with depression, anxiety, PTSD, which kids are seeing at higher. It's being reported of clinical at higher and higher levels, and it's so hard. It's so
Right.
hard.
You really have to hold both of those as being true at the same time, the
Yeah,
potential to heal and the potential to harm. And I will say, in the sort of public discourse, especially around legalization, the benefits have been promoted, and the risks have been downplayed. And so that in of itself gives kind of a distorted perception of risk, and that's problematic too.
certainly is. That's the same thing that happened with marijuana. Is there any state that has done a good job legalizing this and rolling out good safety rails, guardrails? Because Colorado did a terrible job with marijuana. We had medical cards first, and you could go and get as much medical as you wanted and share it and sell it to everybody else. And then we have recreational marijuana, and it kind of took away the medical thing. But physicians were giving young kids medical cards. Is there a state that's legalizing psychedelics in a good way that could be a good model?
Well, right now it's just Colorado and Oregon.
Is that
Those
it?
those are the only two states. It's been decriminalized in different cities. So Washington D.C., San Francisco, but those are the only states. And I do think, I mean, Oregon is having some problems, but I do think their approach was better because they rolled out their therapeutic framework at the same time as the personal, and they gave it like a 2 year runway to kind of plan and get it out. Now, for me, the right order of operations is to create the medical framework first, because then individuals, that's kind of the institutional structure that we have in our culture that we could plug into to create a safe container, right? If you think about these indigenous cultures that we reference, I mean, they really did have their own regulations. They had a faith leader, a shaman, a priest who had the substances, who understood their safe use, who oversaw the use, right, and the safety of an experienced community. And we don't have any of that in our secular culture. And so that's kind of what the medical framework could be for safety. I would do that first. And then I would think about the sort of personal use with safeguards like public information, product safety information, which is now not given, harm reduction programs, first responder and emergency staff training, data collection. You know, we really don't understand the prevalence of psychedelic adverse outcomes. We really don't know how rare they are. People keep saying they're rare, but we don't know because we don't collect that data and we don't know what they are. And so, right, if we're going to base policy and public health programs on data, we need to collect that evidence. So that's kind of how I would roll it out. So I would say Oregon's done a better job, but they're definitely, you know, it's kind of a social experiment in a way.
Wow. Oh, that's disheartening to hear. A social experiment, just like social media and just like cell phones that we've given to our kids. And there's so much correlation between our kids' mental health and the, oh, that's
Yeah.
hard for me to hear as a Colorado resident that this is rolling out in the next year. And I'm pretty informed. I read a lot. And I feel like there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of misunderstanding. Um, it's hard. Like, how do we inform in a way that this is happening? Like,
Right. And I feel like a lot of the discourse is more in the camp of drug promotion, you know, like it's promoting these versus just agnostic, fact-based education. And so that's kind of the space that I'm trying to inhabit, is definitely not being a prohibitionist, but also not being a promoter of drugs and drug use, right? But just this sort of, let's soberly assess what type of information, you know, the public needs, because it's not just kids, it's parents. I mean, I was too young for the 60s. I had never tried psychedelics. I remember Christmas 2019 having a drug conversation with Will. He brought up fentanyl and how scary it was and how he would never touch a powder or a pill. And, you know, we had this great, really interesting conversation, and psychedelics didn't come up. Like, they weren't in my awareness to bring up. And so it's all of us, right? It's like, now that these, you know, in Colorado, they're legal, we all need to educate ourselves. There's one idea too, I think, that's important, especially in Colorado, and that's how cannabis use and psychedelic use maybe don't mix well. And we need to better understand that, because I know of 2 cases in California where young boys, or men in this case, used cannabis regularly and were having some depression and tried to self-treat with psychedelics and ended up hospitalized. And so I just point that out because, you know, we don't talk a lot about sort of the dangers and the risks of mixing those. And with cannabis being so ubiquitous, I think it's a really important thing to talk about and to research and better understand.
Thank you for bringing that up because the attitude toward cannabis in our state is very different, and I try not to be judgmental of it. I'm kind of old school in my thinking. That's why I like how you were not like this. This is not about abstinence, like, but about educating. So I think that's super fair for our listeners to think about, like mixing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh goodness,
Hopefully not.
right? Oh, so with your foundation, let's like turn to like a success story, something that you're like proud of, that the William G. Nash, like you do feel like the work you're doing is making a difference.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mentioned safety first, and I'm really proud of it, and I'm really excited. So you can go to the Stanford Reach Lab website and see that, and that's free. I mean, and it's used in high schools all over the country. There's a documentary film called Screenagers. Don't know.
Yes, I've heard of it.
So it's a trilogy. The first one was Teens and Screens. The second one was Mental Health. The third one is called Screenagers Under the Influence. And so the foundation is in that movie, and Will's story, just sort of raising the awareness about harm reduction focused education. And that film is out now, so schools and communities can subscribe to it, and it's just a good impetus for great community conversations, not just for psychedelics, but all drugs, cannabis and vaping, and so I'm
Screenagers does a great job. I did when you now I'm like, oh my gosh, I remember hearing William G. Nash when I watched that screen because I've seen all of them. I think they're great conversation starters. And just how you were talking about like Will being in 2019, like that you didn't have that conversation with him about psychedelics, like Robbie dying at the age of 15, like I didn't have the conversation with him about suicide. Like that never, and I was a pretty informed mom. I didn't have to be a helicopter mom, but I never talked to him about, have you ever considered suicide? And if you ever considered suicide, what would you do? So,
right,
conversations ahead of time and not when we're in anger and we're in crisis and not when a person is depressed and angry and so many things.
right, right, right.
What else are you super proud of, Kristen? I know there's like many wins, which that's why we keep waking up every day and doing this work.
Yeah, I guess I would say the other thing is around harm reduction specific to the college campus. So I've worked with a PhD student, she's now doctor, to create a harm reduction toolkit for the college and university setting. And it's all evidence-based harm reduction programs. And we have 2 talks coming up to administrators at colleges and universities to sort of present the idea of harm reduction and what works according to the evidence. And so we have a toolkit, we have a peer-reviewed article coming out, and a couple talks. So just trying to get this idea that, especially you probably have seen the Monitoring the Future data, that cannabis use and psychedelic use are at historic highs among young people. And so this is happening. And so how can we be really constructive and create communities of caring and wellness and safety according to the evidence? So yeah, trying to sort of disseminate that evidence and do new research where it's warranted.
It's exciting. Putting a young person through college. My daughter is 24. So I remember sitting at parent orientation. Elizabeth went to Boston University, but like I remember just the talk that they gave incoming freshmen about alcohol. And I thought it was did such a nice job. Like, these are 18-year-olds and like, yeah, it wasn't about abstinence. It was more about like that clear head and thinking ahead of time and how would you respond and what would you say? And I guess I talked about sexual assault in the same conversation, but I suspect now if my young person was going to college, they would be talking about psychedelics, about marijuana, about all these substances like Will was fentanyl. Like the kids know that they need to be aware that fentanyl is there and very, very
Right.
harmful.
Right. And hopefully the college will touch on it multiple times, not just at that orientation assembly, but they need to come back to it again and again and create infrastructures for those conversations over time.
Oh, that's such a good point. Even for parents, all of these conversations, like that's what I like. I guess I have two more questions, maybe three, because this is just such a good topic. Um, like the secretive nature of drug use, and like how does a parent talk to like a 16-year-old, an 18-year-old, a 20-year-old? What advice do you have there?
Well, and I'm not an expert on this, but the best advice that I've seen is actually in that Screenagers movie, and it's to do a lot of listening. To ask questions and listen and understand, what the young person knows, what they're thinking about, what they're interested in, with respect, right? Because if we react and if we overreact with anger and judgment, then they're going to shut down and we won't hear anything. So it's like, I think using, respectful listening and genuine inquiry is the best way to kind of cultivate that relationship. And then, if you need to kind of intervene, or if, okay, we're good. But you want your kid to come to you with questions. Yeah.
That's fantastic advice. I always say, because we're trying to encourage adults to have more conversations with kids, and two ears, one mouth. Like, listen twice as much as you talk. Like, our kids, if you want to have more of a relationship and have more conversation, and when we're uncomfortable with something, what do? We talk. We fill the space. We're great at just talking,
Right.
talking, versus taking that time to just listen.
So true. And I think safety first is doing a parent guide, like a companion guide, which I also think would be great for parents so they know what their young person is learning, but it also just gives prompts. Screenagers has this too. Prompts, a lot of listening and then helpful probing questions.
Open-ended, not a yes, no.
Yeah.
That's so good. This has been a great conversation. This is super helpful to me as a Colorado resident, as a person who cares about young people, who's trying to be informed, and sharing my knowledge with other parents on a scary topic. Truly, this is a scary topic.
Yeah.
So I'm just super grateful for your time this morning, working through the tech difficulties that we had. Good old, because you're in California, I'm in Denver. Good stuff. But Kristen, we end every conversation with the same question, and this can apply to what we've talked about this morning or whatever you would like. So I guess that's you don't have to overthink this one. What does the world need to hear right now?
I think the world needs to hear balance. I think the world needs to hear each other, meaning that in so many of the conversations I'm having, people get so polarized that they stop listening to each other. And I'm just feeling like there's this really important space, I call it the middle lane, where we can both understand that decriminalizing drugs does have some benefits because it takes it out of the shadows, it removes stigma, it increases help-seeking behaviors and information seeking, right? It does those things. But drugs also have a lot of harms and a lot of risks, and we need to talk about those, and we need to safeguard against those. So we need to hold multiple things as being true at the same time, and we need to forge the middle lane.
That's fantastic. Oh, I feel like I want to have you back in like 6 or 12 months as Colorado progresses. And because I feel like I'm going to be a little bit more informed, but this conversation is going to be so helpful to our listeners. I am sorry for your loss of Will, reading about him. And
likewise, I'm sorry for Robbie.
Yeah. So with that, Kristen, and to our listeners, thank you so much for your time. And until our next episode, remember hope. Hold on, pain ends. Thank you.